She was told she didn't belong, humiliated in front of strangers, and escorted off a flight she paid for, all because of her skin color. No arguments, no investigation, no apology. Just a quiet assumption that she had no place in first class. But what no one realized, not the attendants, not the passengers, not even the captain, was that removing her wasn't just a mistake. It was the kind of mistake that would shake the entire airline industry. This wasn't just about race. It was about power, perception, and the price of pride. What happens when the person you try to silence has the ability to bring your world to its knees? Stay with us as we uncover a true story that exposes everything. If you believe respect should never be a luxury, if you're ready for the truth behind the uniform, like this video, subscribe for more powerful stories, and drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what would you have done in her place? At precisely 10:12 a.m., Mavis Tillman stepped onto the jet bridge of Flight 749 to San Diego, her stride composed and deliberate. She had made this journey dozens of times before, but today was different. Not because of the flight or the destination, but because of the weight of anticipation she carried quietly within. Clad in a sleek gray pantsuit, her polished leather heels clicked softly against the textured flooring. Her shoulder bag, worn but elegant, rested firmly against her side. In her hand was a first-class boarding pass, seat 2A, issued and confirmed days in advance. She had planned this trip carefully, blocking off her schedule, coordinating client meetings, and finally making time for herself. The reward was small, just one morning of peace before business resumed. At the gate, Loretta Wiles stood with the poise of someone who had worked the airline counter long enough to master the performance of professionalism. Her navy uniform was crisp, her badge perfectly aligned, and her smile so practiced it no longer required thought. That smile, however, slipped momentarily as her eyes landed on Mavis. A flicker of something unreadable passed across her face. Mavis held out her pass, and Loretta took it without a word, scanning it briskly. Instead of gesturing toward the plane like she had for the passenger just before, Loretta paused. She furrowed her brow slightly, as if spotting a discrepancy that didn't exist. Then, without returning the pass, she tilted her head and asked Mavis to step aside for just a moment. No reason given, no explanation offered. Mavis complied, her posture straight, her expression calm. She moved out of a line and waited as Loretta continued to scan the next few passengers. Minutes passed. The line dwindled. Mavis stood still, quietly aware of the optics of her position, stationary, questioned, and singled out. A white man with sandy hair, wearing a loose linen blazer and no tie, approached the counter next. Loretta's demeanor shifted instantly. She lit up, her tone warmer, and after a glance at his pass, she smiled and welcomed him aboard without hesitation. The man turned and walked through the gate with a nod, completely unaware of the subtle exchange that had just occurred behind him. Loretta finally turned back to Mavis. Her voice was polite but firm. She said there had been a last-minute seating change, that first class had been adjusted due to capacity balancing, and that Mavis's new seat would now be in the main cabin. She didn't say economy. She didn't have to. Mavis's eyebrows twitched, just barely. Her eyes, framed by a subtle line of eyeliner and years of experience, locked with Loretta's. She said nothing. Instead, she accepted the replacement boarding slip handed to her like an afterthought. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She walked forward, straight-backed, heels clicking with the same precision they had held before. She passed the curtain that separated class and cabin, walked through the sea of wide leather chairs and chilled glasses of champagne, and down toward the narrow aisle of coach. She placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her, fastened her belt, and folded her hands on her lap. The air felt different here. It wasn't colder, not physically, but the way space was compressed and the way people avoided eye contact said enough. Across the aisle, a woman scrolled through her phone without noticing her. A man adjusted his briefcase underfoot, accidentally bumping her leg before mumbling a non-committal apology. Mavis remained still. She looked out the window and let her breathing slow. Her seat, the one she paid for, the one confirmed by her assistant and noted in her itinerary, was now occupied by someone else. Someone who had not been asked to step aside. Someone who had not been pulled out of line for system verification. Someone who, simply by standing where they stood, was assumed to belong. As the plane finished boarding, Mavis caught a glimpse through the crack in the curtain. The man in the linen blazer leaned back in seat 2A, a glass of water on his tray and a folded newspaper in his lap. Loretta passed him with a soft chuckle, asking if he needed anything before takeoff. He smiled. Mavis watched that moment pass like a bead of water sliding down glass. Smooth, casual, effortless. She turned her head away. She had seen this happen before, though never quite like this. She didn't need confirmation. The truth sat heavy in her chest. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't random. This wasn't about weight balance or booking errors. It was about comfort zones and who was allowed inside them. She knew the difference, and so did Loretta. Obedience dressed in grace. But now, 10 minutes into the flight, her fingers moved with quiet resolve. She typed out a short email and marked it for delayed send. Then she tucked her phone away and unfastened her seatbelt. The seat creaked softly as she stood. She smoothed the front of her blazer and made her way back toward the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. As she approached, the younger attendant, smaller, with dark-rimmed glasses and a nervous smile, noticed her movement and straightened. Mavis nodded politely, requesting to speak with the flight supervisor. The attendant hesitated, glanced toward the galley, and then walked off without a word. A moment later, a tall man in a charcoal vest and polished shoes emerged. His name tag read Darryl. His expression was calm, professional, practiced. Mavis had seen the look before, the expression of someone trained to make situations disappear, not solve them. She greeted him with quiet courtesy and explained the issue succinctly. Her ticket, the reassignment, the unexplained downgrade. Her tone was firm but void of anger. She asked if he could clarify how such a change had occurred. Darryl nodded slowly, offered her an apologetic smile that didn't match his eyes, and responded with a line that might as well have been printed on the back of his badge. "Ma'am, this appears to have been a systems adjustment. Occasionally, our software reallocates seating based on check-in variables." He added that it wasn't personal. She had been reassigned to ensure optimal balance across the aircraft. Then he gestured softly toward the aisle, indicating that she should return to her seat while they filed an internal report. Mavis didn't move. She kept her voice level. "I understand," she said, "but I would like to know why that system adjustment only applied to me." Darryl's lips pressed together in a sympathetic line, but no new explanation came. When she asked for documentation or a written confirmation of a change, his posture shifted. His voice turned slightly firmer. "I'm afraid that information is proprietary." She tilted her head. Proprietary. That word had been used too often to protect procedures that didn't want to stand in the daylight. From her peripheral, a voice chimed in. A man seated near the bulkhead, clean-shaven and wearing a travel blazer, leaned slightly into the aisle. He had been watching the exchange. "That's not right," he said, his voice calm but clear. "If this lady paid for first class, she shouldn't be in coach because of a system." The attendant beside him flinched slightly. Darryl's eyes moved quickly toward the man, then back to Mavis. "Thank you, sir, but we've got it under control," he replied smoothly. The man didn't back down. "I don't think you do," he said, his tone sharpening. "If it were me, I'd be furious." Before he could continue, Loretta appeared, her stride clipped and her smile brittle. She approached the man and spoke quietly, leaning just close enough to make it feel like a correction. "Sir, we kindly ask that passengers refrain from interfering with operational matters." Her words were coded in politeness, but the warning beneath was unmistakable. The man leaned back in his seat reluctantly. His expression soured, but he said nothing more. Mavis exhaled through her nose, steady and slow. She turned her gaze back to Darryl. "I want a record of this incident," she said. "I'll be following up." He nodded, overly cooperative now, as though trying to draw a curtain over the scene. "Of course, ma'am, I'll file a note in the system. We appreciate your patience." She nodded once and stepped away, but she did not return to her seat. Instead, she moved slowly toward the lavatory, entering not because she needed to, but because it gave her space to think. Behind the narrow metal door, she leaned against the sink and stared into the small mirror. Her reflection was unreadable. She had long learned how to mask offense with elegance, how to clothe indignity in restraint. But inside, the sense of exposure lingered. Not the kind that came from being seen, but from being dismissed. She emerged a few minutes later, walked back to her row, and resumed her seat with a grace that made the process feel like a silent ceremony. The man next to her, the one who had spoken up, offered her a sidelong glance. "Brave of you," he muttered. "Or maybe just right." She didn't respond. Not yet. Further down the aisle, Daryl stood near the galley, tapping notes into a tablet with calculated slowness. Loretta whispered something to him, arms crossed, glancing briefly in Mavis's direction. Their words were out of earshot, but their posture told story. One that didn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. They weren't worried about policy. They were managing optics. She replayed the blank expression on Daryl's face, the veiled dismissal in Loretta's tone, and the weight of being quietly moved from a space she had earned into one where no one asked her name. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Her eyes remained fixed on the seat back in front of her, but inside her thoughts ran fast and sharp. The man in her original seat, 2A, was now reclining comfortably with a drink in his hand. From the aisle, she had seen him flipping through a magazine, as if nothing in the world concerned him. Not the injustice, not the violation, not the woman who had paid for that very chair. She inhaled slowly and made a decision. Standing once more, she gathered her bag with quiet precision and moved toward the front of the plane. She didn't look around. She didn't announce her intent. Her walk was purposeful, not defiant. And as she stepped past the curtain and into the first-class section, a ripple of confusion passed through a few seated passengers. Her gaze landed on seat 2A, still warm, still rightfully hers. She stopped beside it and turned toward the man in the linen blazer, who looked up, surprised but not alarmed. She didn't speak to him. Instead, she faced Loretta, who was walking down the aisle with a tray of drinks, and said clearly and calmly, "I'm returning to the seat I paid for." Loretta's smile vanished. She blinked once, as if trying to compute whether she had heard correctly. Then her expression tightened with visible irritation. Her voice rose, louder than necessary, carrying across the cabin like an alarm. "Ma'am, you are not authorized to be in this section. Please return to your assigned seat immediately." Every head in first class turned. The man in 2A shifted uncomfortably, clearly not eager to be part of this confrontation. Someone behind him put down their headphones. Another reached for their phone. Mavis remained still. Her tone did not match the chaos in Loretta's, but her presence did. "This is my seat. I reserved it. I paid for it. I confirmed it with your team." Loretta's face flushed. Her voice jumped another octave. "I'm going to ask you one more time to return to economy. If you refuse, I will be forced to take action." She spoke with the sharp cadence of someone who wanted not just compliance, but submission. Mavis did not move. A silence fell over the cabin. Passengers froze, waiting to see how far this would go. Loretta tapped the comms button near the galley and made a brief announcement to the cabin crew, requesting support. Within seconds, the door to the cockpit area opened, and a uniformed airline security agent stepped into view. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the detached expression of someone trained to enforce without context. Loretta turned to him and gestured toward Mavis. "She is refusing to comply with crew instructions." The man didn't ask questions. He walked forward, stopping directly in front of Mavis. His eyes were blank, unreadable, but his stance was firm. Passengers held their breath. Some began filming, their hands shaking slightly. Others looked away, ashamed to be watching but unable to stop. Mavis glanced at the camera phones, not for protection, but as acknowledgement. She had always known the world didn't see her the way it saw others. But today, she wanted the world to look. to truly see. The agent spoke calmly. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat, or we will be forced to escort you off this aircraft." Mavis nodded slowly. She understood what was at stake. Not just the seat, not just the flight, but the idea that silence was the only way to survive in dignity. Her next move was deliberate. She reached into her bag, pulled out a thin leather wallet, and extracted a laminated card. With steady fingers, she extended it to the security officer. He read it, blinked, read it again. His expression changed. Subtly, but undeniably. He looked at her, then at Loretta, then back at the card. There was a pause. A heavy one. Mavis said nothing. She didn't need to. Whatever was printed on that card shifted the current under the surface. The agent's shoulders tightened slightly, but he handed the card back with an almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned to Loretta and said something quietly. Loretta's face went pale. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked at Mavis, not with anger this time, but with something closer to fear. Mavis didn't sit down. She didn't raise her voice. She simply held her ground as the plane hung in a strange, suspended moment of reckoning. Passengers watched, some unsure whether to cheer or recoil. The man in 2A stood up quickly, gathered his bag, and muttered that he didn't want to be involved. He stepped aside. Mavis looked at the now vacant seat. She didn't rush. She moved with the calmness of inevitability and sat down. The leather armrest felt no different. The legroom hadn't changed. But the message had. Loretta stood frozen for a beat, then turned away, disappearing toward the galley without another word. The security officer followed. Mavis remained composed, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on her thighs. She had faced worse. She had endured more. But the sting of public humiliation had a way of lingering even beneath the thickest armor. Behind her, she could hear whispers. They slid through the cabin like smoke, curling into conversations in half-sentences and unfinished thoughts. Is she someone important? Why would security back off like that? Did you see her just stand there and not flinch? But louder than the whispers was the silence from the crew. Loretta had vanished into the galley, and the other attendants moved stiffly through their routines, avoiding Mavis's gaze, avoiding any mention of what had just happened. Except for one. Veronica Shaw stepped out from the service area with a tray in hand and a practiced smile stretched thin across her face. Her blonde hair was pulled back tight, not a strand out of place, and her steps echoed with rehearsed confidence. She approached the front cabin like someone entering a stage, aware of every eye that followed her. She made her way down the aisle, offering drinks with robotic precision, exchanging polite nods. But when she reached Mavis, her performance cracked. She paused, glanced at the woman now seated where she had clearly not expected her to be, and let her eyes linger for a second too long. Then came the moment. She leaned slightly forward, as if offering a quiet, casual remark, but her voice was pitched just enough to carry 2 or 3 rows. Some passengers just don't understand what first class is supposed to feel like. Her tone was light, almost playful, but the implication landed like a slap. Mavis didn't react. Not with words. Not yet. But her eyes locked with Veronica's and held steady. There was no confusion in that look, no misunderstanding about what had been said. Veronica straightened and turned to the next passenger as if nothing had happened. But others had heard. A man 2 rows back tilted his phone slightly, angling the lens just above the seat ahead of him. A woman across the aisle narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a disapproving line. The energy had shifted again, and this time it wasn't in favor of the crew. Mavis reached for her bag and pulled out her tablet, not to distract herself, but to record the moment in detail, as she always did in corporate boardrooms: time, tone, sequence. She wrote with fluid control, logging every word spoken and every reaction observed. Meanwhile, the man with the phone quietly tapped the screen and hit the live broadcast icon. He adjusted the angle so that it captured Veronica at the front of the cabin, the image of Mavis seated calmly, and the ambient tension that had settled over the passengers like fog. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The visual spoke for itself. Within minutes, The live stream began drawing comments. Who is she? Why is that flight attendant acting like that? Is this racial profiling or what? Viewers flooded in by the dozens, then by the hundreds. On the screen, the man's fingers could be seen briefly swiping through settings, checking that his name was hidden, that his account remained anonymous. The camera never left the cabin. The angle was steady, the feed clear. The audience grew by the second. Back on board, Veronica continued down the aisle, seemingly unaware that she had just become the subject of a public broadcast. Her smile returned, but it lacked its earlier confidence. There was a slight tremble in her hand when she poured a drink for the passenger in 3A. The energy in the cabin had changed again, and this time it was no longer controlled by the crew. Now it belonged to the collective judgment of everyone watching, on board and off. Mavis didn't look at the camera. She didn't acknowledge the man recording, but she knew. She had seen it happen before in other industries, in other rooms. When silence no longer protected you, visibility became your only weapon. She adjusted the cuffs of her blazer and sat a little taller. This wasn't about revenge. This was about light. And now the spotlight was no longer hers alone. Farther down the plane, Loretta peeked from behind the galley curtain and whispered something to Veronica, who stiffened and glanced back toward Mavis. Their eyes met again. Mavis remained still, composed, unreadable. Veronica's face twitched with something: discomfort, regret, or maybe just fear of exposure. It was hard to tell, but one thing was clear: the illusion of power had cracked. Veronica had retreated to the galley. Loretta whispered behind curtain, and Darryl stared too long at his screen, pretending to review procedures, but clearly unsettled. And Mavis Tillman sat in 2A, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, surrounded not by comfort, but by the tension of a system being forced into visibility. The plane had begun to taxi, slow and mechanical, but then came the chime. A double tone echoed through the cabin, followed by the sterile voice of the flight deck. Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently experiencing a brief delay in our departure. We appreciate your patience and will provide updates shortly. The message ended with rehearsed warmth, but the undertone was unmistakable. Something was happening. The engines continued to hum, but the wheels remained still. Mavis closed her tablet and placed it neatly into her bag. She knew this rhythm. Delay under the guise of order. Procedure used as a weapon. She had seen it before, not on planes, but in boardrooms, in audit meetings, in regulatory reviews, when the question wasn't what happened, but how to manage the fallout. The curtain parted and Loretta returned, now with Darryl close behind. Darryl crouched slightly beside Mavis, his voice pitched low but firm. Captain Monroe would like to speak with you privately in the jet bridge. Mavis looked at him evenly. Is this a formal request? Darryl blinked. The captain just wants to ensure we're proceeding safely and respectfully. That was the word. Respectfully. Dressed in diplomacy, but smelling of dismissal. Mavis stood slowly. She adjusted her jacket, lifted her bag, and followed Darryl down the aisle. Passengers avoided eye contact. A few watched silently. One older woman gave a small, sympathetic nod. Another man glanced away, ashamed. The man who had live-streamed earlier held his phone lower now, not broadcasting, only recording. The walk down the aisle felt longer than it was. It was the same path she had walked an hour ago, with the same dignity, but now it felt like a corridor of judgment. At the front of the aircraft, the door to the cockpit stood open. Captain Monroe emerged, tall and weathered, with silver streaks at his temples, and the worn authority of someone who had flown longer than he had listened. He nodded at Mavis with forced courtesy. Thank you for coming forward. His voice was low, deliberate. He gestured toward the open bridge, and they stepped just outside the aircraft door. The hum of the terminal filtered in, a reminder that the outside world still existed. Monroe folded his hands behind his back. Ms. Tillman, I've been made aware of the incident in the cabin. After careful consideration, and in the interest of safety and minimizing disruption, I'm requesting that you voluntarily deplane. Mavis stared at him. Voluntarily? She asked. Monroe's jaw tightened slightly. We have to consider all passengers. Your continued presence appears to be a catalyst for disruption. Catalyst. A word that turned blame into formality. Mavis kept her voice even. Are you removing me because of crew discomfort or because of protocol? Monroe hesitated. I'm removing you because I must ensure we depart without further escalation. Her tone sharpened. You mean without accountability? Monroe looked past her toward the terminal. Security's already been informed. They'll ensure you're rebooked without issue. Mavis didn't answer. She turned her head toward the interior of the aircraft, toward the seat she had bought, the one she had been moved from, the one she had returned to with dignity. Then she nodded. Not because she agreed, but because she understood. There was nothing more dangerous to a structure built on quiet bias than a person who refused to be quiet. She stepped back into the plane, now just to retrieve her belongings. The passengers watched, some with shame, some with approval, but most with that quiet, practiced stillness that had always protected injustice. Loretta stood stiffly at the front galley, Veronica behind her, arms crossed and avoiding eye contact. Daryl's gaze dropped to the floor. Mavis said nothing to any of them. She lifted her bag from the overhead bin, turned without a word, and walked back down the jet bridge. As she did, the door closed behind her with a hydraulic sigh, like a system relieved to return to its pattern. Back in the terminal, she stood near gate 33A, composed but simmering. She pulled out her phone and canceled the delayed email. Then she opened a new message. It had no subject, no greeting, only 4 lines. Flight 749. Incident recorded. Passenger removed after crew discrimination. Legal action pending. Then she hit send. To anyone else, she was just another passenger delayed, another face in the crowd. But for Mavis, this was not a delay. This was a pause before a reckoning. Her phone vibrated in her hand. Notifications had begun to flood in. She didn't need to read them yet. The live stream had taken on a life of its own. She could already feel it moving beyond the confines of that aircraft cabin, echoing through digital corridors and inboxes across the country. She turned from the window and walked toward the main terminal lounge, seeking a quieter space to sit. The tension in her chest hadn't lessened, but her focus had sharpened. She passed a woman standing at the customer service desk, tall, blonde, draped in a soft blue shawl, speaking with an assertive calm that came from years of being accommodated. The woman gestured toward her boarding pass and pointed toward the screen showing available seating. The attendant nodded, typing without hesitation, and after a few seconds printed a new boarding slip. First class to business, business to first, a swap made effortlessly. The woman smiled, took her new pass, and walked off without a glance back. Mavis paused nearby, pretending to check her phone while watching the interaction play out. No resistance. No questions. No supervisor summoned. The same system that had told her there were no alternatives had just made space for someone else. A familiar ache formed in her stomach, not because she was surprised, but because the pattern was so precise it no longer felt like coincidence. It felt engineered. She exhaled through her nose and took a seat near a column, placing her bag beside her and folding her hands carefully. Moments later, a quiet voice approached from her right. "Excuse me." Mavis looked up. A woman in her early 30s stood slightly hunched, as if trying not to draw attention. She wore a staff badge clipped discreetly to the inside of her cardigan and carried a tablet in one hand, a set of keys in the other. Her hair was pulled back, face pale beneath tired eyes. She looked at Mavis, not with pity, but with recognition. "I saw what happened." Her voice trembled slightly. "I was in the gate control booth when they pushed the cabin delay through." Mavis said nothing, simply raised an eyebrow. The woman glanced over her shoulder, then leaned in. "Look, I don't want to get involved formally, but I just have to say it. If you are who I think you are, they made a serious mistake. Like career-ending." Mavis tilted her head slightly. The woman hesitated. "I can't say more, but I recognized your name when they flagged it. The booking system had a tag I've only seen twice before. It's used for people on the executive advisory register. She lowered her voice even more. "And they still moved you. That's not a glitch. That's deliberate." For a second, Mavis felt the hum beneath her skin shift. She had suspected. Now she knew. Not only had they chosen to remove her, but they had overridden flags that should have protected her status. Status she never flaunted, but which existed for a reason. The staffer took a step back, wringing her hands. "I shouldn't have said anything, but I had to. They've made a mess they won't be able to mop up quietly. Not this time." She walked away quickly, disappearing down the corridor toward the operations office. Mavis sat still, her heart not racing, but heavy. The fog of doubt cleared. This wasn't just a bad decision. This wasn't a miscommunication. It was a decision rooted in assumption and reinforced by hierarchy. They saw a black woman in first class and chose to test her, then chose to remove her. And now the test would become a trial, one she would not walk away from quietly. She opened her phone and checked the live feed again. The video now had over 80,000 views. Comments flooded in from every direction. Some outraged, some shocked, others quietly affirming. Finally, someone caught it on camera. She scrolled briefly, then tapped open her encrypted messaging app and began composing a direct note. Not to legal, not to press, but to someone in the executive wing of the airline's parent company. Someone who would recognize her name. The gears had shifted. This was escalation. She glanced out the window once again. Flight 749 was still at the edge of the tarmac, grounded under the illusion of procedural delay. The runway beyond glinted beneath the sun, but her attention was locked onto that aircraft. Not because she was trying to get back on it, not anymore, but because she had just decided it would not leave without consequences. She tapped open her secure calling app. There were only 3 names in this category of her contacts. She chose the second. The call rang once. A low click sounded, then silence. Her voice was low, measured, but held the force of years behind it. Activate Clause 21. Prevent Flight 749 from departing. Confirm when grounded. She ended the call before a response came. It was not a request. It was a command. She placed the phone face down on the table. Her reflection in the polished surface stared back at her, not a woman scorned, not a victim, but a strategist initiating checkmate. Around her, the airport moved as usual. Announcements continued. Luggage carts rolled past. But a shift was underway, invisible to most, unstoppable to those who knew what to look for. Inside the operations control center, several monitors flashed yellow as alerts were triggered by back-end protocol systems. A supervisor picked up a handset, spoke in code, and within 60 seconds, a flight safety team was activated. The authorization level attached to Mavis's clause was not ordinary. It belonged to a portfolio-level stakeholder with emergency override privileges. The type of clearance used only under contract breach or immediate reputational threat. Someone was already tracing the incident report, piecing together timestamps and pulling crew logs. On the tarmac, a black airport operations SUV rolled out of a hangar bay and headed straight toward the aircraft. Inside were 4 individuals, 2 from a compliance division, 1 from legal, and 1 from the executive wing of Skybridge Holdings, the conglomerate that owned the airline. None of them were smiling. None of them needed introductions. Back in the aircraft, the crew was preparing for departure. The flight attendants had resumed pre-takeoff procedures. The captain's voice had reassured passengers they were next in line for clearance. But just as Loretta reached for the intercom to finalize cabin checks, a knock came from the forward door. A sharp triple tap, firm and unmistakable. Darryl opened the door, expecting perhaps another delay notice. Instead, he found himself staring at a woman in a black blazer with a federal style badge, flanked by 3 other individuals wearing identifications marked internal investigations. She spoke before he could. Effective immediately, all personnel on this aircraft are to disembark. This flight is suspended pending review. No exceptions. The statement hit the cabin like a silent explosion. Passengers leaned into the aisle, murmurs rising into a crescendo. One child asked loudly if the plane was broken. Loretta froze near the beverage station. Veronica gripped the back of a seat for balance. The captain stepped into the aisle, demanding to know the basis of this action. He was met with a sealed envelope, delivered into his hand without another word. He opened it, scanned the contents, and his posture changed. Not confusion, not resistance, just quiet resignation. The crew was instructed to leave their equipment and exit immediately. No packing, no explanations to passengers. Just exit. Veronica tried to speak, but her voice faltered. Daryl muttered something about contacting legal, but no one was listening anymore. The authority in the cabin had shifted. Every word spoken now was being recorded, every face being watched. One passenger turned to his seatmate and whispered, "I think we're on the wrong flight for the right kind of story." Within 10 minutes, the entire crew was escorted off the plane. The doors were sealed again, not for takeoff, but for evidence preservation. Internal teams began conducting interviews in a back conference room, and the security footage from boarding gate 33A was requested in full. The man who had live-streamed the earlier confrontation now had his phone tucked into his pocket, his expression stunned as he muttered, "Did she just ground a whole damn plane?" Mavis received a message. A single line. "Flight grounded. All crew detained." She smiled, not from triumph, but from certainty. Certainty that systems can be challenged, and when done right, they don't just bend. Within hours, however, that tide surged into a full-blown wave when the identity behind the poised woman in seat 2A was confirmed by an industry insider. A single tweet with a screenshot of a corporate profile and the caption, "That woman they removed, she's the CEO of Helix Venture Group. $2.1 billion invested into Skybridge Airlines last fiscal quarter." From that moment, the narrative was no longer about just a mistreated passenger. It was about a corporate force wronged by the very system she had helped finance. Reporters scrambled to verify. Screenshots circulated showing Mavis's name on multiple boards, her involvement in infrastructure deals, and her high-level advisory position for Skybridge Holdings, the conglomerate behind the airline. Mavis Tillman, CEO, strategic investor, key stakeholder. The woman they ejected for being out of place was, in fact, the one who helped keep the place afloat. By midday, news banners flashed across national media. A prominent business network ran a headline that read, "Executive humiliated by airline she helped fund." Another declared, "Flight delay turns into corporate crisis as billionaire CEO removed from first-class seat." Networks pulled archived interviews with Mavis from years past. Clips of her speaking at diversity summits, tech expos, and leadership forums resurfaced, painting a clear portrait of a woman who had worked for decades to build influence, only to be undermined by assumptions inside a system she once believed she could improve. In response, the airline's PR department moved quickly, but not quickly enough. Their first statement lacked acknowledgement, offering only regret for any inconvenience caused. That was met with swift backlash. Social media called it tone-deaf, empty, and corporate denial. So the statement was pulled. A second, more cautious draft followed, this time naming the flight and vaguely referring to the company's commitment to equity and inclusion. But the damage had already metastasized. Internal documents began leaking. Screenshots revealed the override of Mavis's VIP designation in the system. A memo showed that Daryl, the flight supervisor, had flagged her as a possible seat misallocation without verifying status. Loretta's prior HR reprimands resurfaced. Veronica's training logs showed she had completed the company's diversity module in under 6 minutes, one of the lowest completion rates in the system. Investors began to take notice. At 1:47 p.m., Skybridge Holdings stock dipped by 4% following trending alerts attached to the scandal. By 2:10 p.m., Mavis's company Helix Venture Group issued a formal statement confirming they were reviewing all active transportation-related partnerships for potential withdrawal, citing breaches of protocol, reputational risk, and contractual ethics clauses. The phrase "material breach" was used. It echoed across markets with the force of a thunderclap. Inside the airline's headquarters, panic moved like electricity. The executive floor called emergency meetings. Legal was looped into every conversation. Public relations teams rewrote their third apology draft 5 times in under 30 minutes. Board members debated whether the CEO of Skybridge should step down or issue a public apology immediately. Even ground operations were advised to stand by for potential directives impacting all flights nationwide. At the center of the storm, Mavis remained composed. She had relocated to a reserved suite inside the executive lounge, away from cameras, but fully aware of the chaos outside. Her phone vibrated steadily with calls, messages, alerts, and requests for comment. She answered none of them. Instead, she made a single internal call to her general counsel and gave a short directive. Compile every interaction from the moment the boarding pass was scanned. Build the timeline. Secure the surveillance. Quietly confirm if this has happened to any of our associates in the past 2 years. Outside, the media had begun to gather at the terminal. Local news vans idled curbside. Correspondents stood under umbrellas, speaking to cameras about how a routine flight had exposed deep fractures in corporate responsibility. Travelers nearby whispered her name, Mavis Tillman. Some said they had heard of her. Others had never seen her, but were now glued to their phones trying to understand how someone like her had been treated like someone invisible. Meanwhile, the man who had filmed the original video found his footage rebroadcast on every major network. He gave no interviews. He simply posted a follow-up. I didn't know who she was. I just knew what happened wasn't right. The comment below read, she didn't need to raise her voice. She changed the game with silence. By 4 p.m., several advocacy groups issued public letters to the airline demanding accountability. Petitions circulated demanding the termination of the involved staff and a third-party audit of their training practices. Mavis's name trended alongside words like justice, dignity, and reform. The memo was circulated quietly through internal channels at Skybridge Airlines, flagged with a red priority icon and authorized by the parent company's crisis division. The employees in question were not notified with ceremony. They were each contacted by their respective supervisors, summoned into brief, tense meetings behind closed doors, and relieved of duty without discussion. Veronica received the call while still on airport grounds, waiting for a union representative to arrive. She had not yet changed out of her uniform, and her badge was still clipped to her chest when she was asked to surrender it. Her reaction was muted, not disbelief, not outrage, but a stunned silence that came from the realization that her world had shifted not just professionally but legally. By that afternoon, the airline's legal team had been served with a formal notice of pending litigation. The claim named Veronica specifically under Title II of the Civil Rights Act, alleging racial discrimination and public humiliation against a passenger in a federally regulated space. It included digital evidence, footage, eyewitness testimony, internal system logs, and documented patterns of behavior from prior complaints. The legal team knew the case would never reach trial. They also knew that settling would require far more than financial reparations. Public accountability was no longer optional. The headlines kept multiplying. Media outlets now referred to the incident as a corporate civil rights breach and a textbook case of executive profiling. Public figures began weighing in. Civil rights leaders called for immediate restructuring within the airline. Corporate watchdogs demanded board-level resignations. Financial analysts tracked the dip in Skybridge holding stock, which by end of day had plummeted nearly 13%, the largest single-day drop in company history. Helix Venture Group issued a second, more direct statement confirming the withdrawal of its multi-year investment agreement, effective immediately. The cancellation terminated over $2 billion in capital and operational funding, impacting 10 major expansion projects and restructuring the airline's long-term growth forecast. One line in the statement echoed throughout boardrooms and media panels alike: "We will not finance systems that cannot uphold basic human dignity." Inside Skybridge's executive offices, the atmosphere was panic layered beneath forced professionalism. The internal task force convened 3 times within 24 hours, with each meeting ending in more questions than answers. The company's CEO, Preston Vale, had remained silent throughout the initial hours, but as pressure mounted and headlines grew more vicious, he was advised by legal and PR to address the public directly. At exactly 8 p.m., he stepped into the glare of national television lights in front of a neutral gray backdrop bearing the airline's logo. His tie was perfectly knotted, his voice steady but clearly rehearsed. He opened by acknowledging the incident, referencing the passenger only as Ms. Tillman, and the situation as deeply regrettable. He admitted systemic failures, expressed empathy, and stated that new policies would be implemented to prevent future incidents. He spoke of training programs, revised oversight procedures, and diversity reforms, but the eyes watching him knew the truth. This was a man scrambling to protect what remained of a fractured empire. His apology was followed by a Q&A session limited to pre-screened media partners. Notably, none of the hard questions were asked, but the public reaction was swift. Social media flooded with comments calling the apology hollow, too late, and self-preserving. Activists demanded real structural change, not corporate performance. Meanwhile, internally, the airline began preparing for audits and investigations. The FAA had already requested compliance records. HR teams initiated reviews of every discrimination complaint filed in the last 5 years. A third-party firm was brought in to conduct a comprehensive cultural assessment. Training budgets were increased. Management meetings were suspended. And the internal diversity officer, previously a part-time consultant, was now a permanent executive role, reporting directly to the board. Veronica, now suspended, remained silent publicly. Her image was removed from the internal staff portal. Employees were instructed not to contact her directly. She had received a legal notice from Mavis Tillman's team informing her of her inclusion in the civil action and advising her to retain counsel. She did. Her lawyer released a short statement denying intentional wrongdoing, stating that Veronica was acting in accordance with policy under pressure, but no one bought the narrative. Public memory had already cemented her face to the act. Daryl, less visible than Veronica, quietly retained representation as well. Captain Monroe's license was placed under review, pending investigation into procedural decisions during the removal. Time passed, but the weight of that flight never quite lifted. A year moved forward, slow but steady, and the world kept turning, though not in the same direction as before. The incident involving Flight 749 had triggered widespread changes across the airline industry, and its tremors reached far beyond Skybridge's crumbling towers. Policies had changed, systems had been rebuilt, and internal codes were rewritten to carry accountability where once there had only been discretion. But change, real change, did not begin in meeting rooms or on press stages. It began quietly, often painfully, inside the very people who had once stood on the wrong side of the truth. Veronica Shaw had disappeared from public view for nearly 12 months. After the suspension, after the lawsuit was filed and eventually settled, after her name stopped trending and the company removed her from all employment records, she withdrew. The world had not forgiven her. She had not forgiven herself. She had replayed the scene countless times, the way she'd walked down the aisle with practiced pride, the way her voice had risen not from duty, but from something uglier, buried so deep she hadn't recognized it until it surfaced in front of hundreds of strangers, and eventually millions more. It was only when she saw her own reflection through the lens of that viral video, detached from intent and stripped of excuses, that she understood. Her tone, her words, her posture, none of it was about following rules. It was about defending power she never earned by denying dignity someone else had paid for. For months she refused interviews, turned down publishers, and ignored media outlets offering redemption in exchange for spectacle. But then she was approached not with microphones or headlines, but with an opportunity to listen. The program was small at first, a nonprofit initiative funded partially by Helix Venture Group and partially by private donors. Its mission was simple: dismantle systemic bias in frontline airline operations. The team included researchers, former aviation executives, equity consultants, and training specialists. At its heart was Mavis Tillman, who after declining every offer to return to corporate boardrooms, instead accepted the invitation to serve as the program's lead advisor. She did not make speeches. She did not lecture. She designed immersive modules, created policy simulations, and insisted that every training involved direct human testimony from both victims and perpetrators. The goal was not punishment. The goal was transformation. Veronica applied quietly, anonymously. Her application included no resume, no references, just a written statement. In it she wrote, "I thought I was just following protocol. But the truth is, I was protecting something inside myself I never questioned. And I let it humiliate someone I should have respected. I don't want to be excused. I want to learn how not to be that person again." She was accepted on probation, under an alias. For weeks, she sat in the back of sessions, silent, absorbing the stories of others. At first, she hated how much she recognized herself in their descriptions. Officers who spoke too sharply, attendants who dismissed, managers who redirected complaints until people gave up. But eventually, something softened. She began asking questions, then listening without defending, then volunteering to help rewrite scripts used in internal response procedures. She cried once during a session about microaggressions, not because she was embarrassed, but because someone else described her without knowing it. The nonprofit filmed a training documentary. At first, Veronica declined to appear, but after discussion with the program director, and eventually with Mavis herself, she agreed to participate on the condition that her name be withheld. The camera captured her silhouette only. No titles, no identifiers, just her voice. In the footage, she confessed what she had come to understand. "I didn't grow up hateful, but I grew up protected from understanding what bias really was. I thought being nice was enough. I thought being colorblind meant I was fair. I was wrong. I ignored what I didn't want to see. And when I was challenged, I responded with fear disguised as authority. And for that, I will always be sorry." Her voice cracked, and she wiped away a tear not for pity, but for clarity. The footage was shown in over 40 airline facilities across the country. Mandatory viewing, paired with Mavis's silent presence in the room, sitting in the back, letting the story unfold without interruption. One day, at a training facility in Dallas, someone noticed a familiar face helping distribute materials. A few recognized her. No one said anything. And then Mavis walked over to her, handed her a folder, and nodded. No speech, no handshake, just recognition. By the end of that year, Veronica was no longer anonymous. She spoke at one summit, a panel titled "Restoring the Human Standard." Mavis introduced her. There was no resentment in her voice, only purpose. Together, they stood on stage, not as enemies, not as opposites, but as 2 points on a line that had bent painfully toward change. Veronica now leads peer-to-peer workshops for new flight crews. She trains not just on regulation, but on presence, on language, on the weight of subtle moments that can shape someone's belief about whether they belong. She no longer wears the old uniform. Instead, she wears a simple pin on her lapel that reads, "Equity is daily work." Mavis continues to advise, but from a quieter position. She has declined all new investments in airlines, choosing instead to fund initiatives that center around accessibility and dignity in transportation infrastructure. Her name is no longer in the headlines, but her presence remains in every policy changed, every crew member retrained, every flight attendant now taught that justice doesn't board the plane last. The end. If this story moved you or made you think differently about justice, dignity, or second chances, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in Stories That Matter. Which part of the story hit you the hardest? Were you surprised by how it all turned out? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And while you're there, tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? We'd love to hear your perspective.